is Solaris God. Solaris, the legendary film by legendary visionary filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky. The USSR's answer to 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's based on Stanislav Lem's novel, another legendary book. Well, many people have seen it, many people have talked about it, and the usual question about Solaris is the ocean planet? The movie is about an ocean planet, and we have a space station, a science station orbiting, and the scientists on board are seeing their unconscious manifested. Solaris, the ocean planet, it's an ocean but also a giant brain, and it is sending manifestations of the scientists' unconscious. Most famously, Chris Kelvin, our hero, who is a psychologist also, and he starts seeing the manifestation of his dead wife who committed suicide. So the question is always, okay, is Solaris trying to communicate? So on the surface, that is the main question of the movie, but really the real question is Solaris God? Is Solaris a metaphor for Tarkovsky's and humanity's attempt to communicate with God, or fear or questioning, like, is God alive? Does God exist? And is God actually trying to communicate with us? It can be ambiguous if it is or if it isn't. But I have to admit that having just rewatched it yesterday, and I really loved it this time. I always felt it was kind of not Tarkovsky's best, but this time I really loved it. But I rewatched it yesterday. There is no question in my mind now that in the movie, Solaris is 100% a metaphor for God. However, there is also a much deeper answer, I think, and I think it is also justified by the text. And the text here, I mean Tarkovsky's movie. I have not reread the novel in a long time. There are two other versions, the American version by Soderbergh, Steven Soderbergh, which is very good but different. There is also a TV movie from 1968. I only saw a few minutes of it, it looks like it's closer to Stanislav Lem's novel. But here I will only be using the text that is Tarkovsky's movie, and we will be diving into Solaris, but also the unconscious itself and Tarkovsky's whole work. So you will see. But the short answer is that yes, Solaris is God, but so is everything. So, is Solaris God? And why do I say that it's obvious? Well, now, having seen more Russian movies and having seen now all of Tarkovsky's film, I watched most of the ones I hadn't seen last winter. Andrei Rublev, The Mirror, Sacrifice, I watched last year, which is amazing. Pretty much all his movies are amazing. Nostalgia. Having watched that and having now the experience of that baggage of understanding more what Tarkovsky is actually doing, it's fairly obvious. Tarkovsky is an artist, like an actual artist. He creates work of art. And as a work of art, the movie is pretty much telling us the whole time that this is a movie about God, and the question is God trying to communicate with us? And the answer is not only yes, but by the end of the movie, and it works. So the movie is about a successful coming into contact with God himself. In this context here, we will say he, because it's obviously more like the Christian God, and in the Christian iconography, very often, usually God is presented masculine, so this will be also the case here. So when I say as a piece of art, what is the first sign that the movie is telling us that Solaris is 100% about God? Well, we know this because the movie starts on Earth, and this was something that was added by Tarkovsky, and I used to think, the few times I've seen it before, or the many times, if you wish, that I had seen the movie before, I always felt, well, this is kind of slow moving, and there's this long sequence, on the highways, where the astronaut Burton is driving and he's the road, and it's just long. Why are we spending all this time in the Kelvin family cottage and by the lake, and Kelvin is, Chris is burning his papers, and let's get on the planet already. But really, that's really missing the point, because the genius of the opening, we start in nature on Earth, and we have a very Tarkovsky shot. Tarkovsky is very famous for his extremely rich textures and his use of water, flowing water, and rivers. Like in Stalker you have that, but very often in his films you have that. So here at the beginning of the movie we have water, vegetation, and so forth. It's very textured and layered, and we always have that in his movies, and we have that here, like in nature, and it is extremely rich and it is extremely beautiful. And Chris Kelvin is walking around in nature, kind of taking it in, because, as we'll soon find out, he's leaving for Solaris and he might never come back. But what are we seeing here? What we are actually seeing is God is expressing himself through the beauty of nature. The beauty and the mystery that is inside the beauty. And this is, I feel, kind of something that is very present in his other movies, like in Mirror, for instance. You have that same idea, or in the forest sequences in Sacrifice. So in essence, and we'll come back to that later, what we have here is nature is extremely beautiful, and it is by our sense of beauty as we interact in that beauty that we know that there is something godlike and ineffable, like unknowable, that is expressing itself, something that we understand immediately but at the same time do not understand. And I think, as we'll see a bit later, this is entirely linked with an element of what I perceive from Russian culture, because I'm not from Russia and I don't know that much from Russian culture, but the Orthodox aspect with the icons. So the importance of the icons and the artistry and the beauty of the icons. And obviously Andrei Rublev, famous iconist. Tarkovsky did before Solaris a movie on Andrei Rublev. So we'll talk about all these things a bit later on. But for now, Chris is on Earth and he's seeing the beauty, and planet Earth is communicating to us the magnitude and the depth of the wonder and all these godlike qualities which we both know and don't know and can appreciate but never really understand. And immediately after that, we have the sequence where Chris is talking to his family and the family friend, Burton the astronaut, who's a friend of Chris's father, and there's also Chris's aunt. I thought it was his mother, but it's actually his aunt, so his father's sister. And what's interesting here is that ostensibly that sequence is exposition. So Burton the astronaut, he's bringing back footage from when he came back from Solaris, and he explained all the things he had seen, like a giant child, a 10-foot high child who was, the projection of the child of an astronaut who had died on Solaris. So all these things. So there's a lot of exposition in that sequence. But what is really being set up here is all the relationships in that sequence between all the human beings are dysfunctional. So Burton has his son who is there, his young son, so maybe that relationship is okay. But basically, Burton is friends with Chris's father, but they have a big argument, and Burton essentially leaves and says, "We're not friends anymore." Burton has come to talk with Chris, but Chris is hyper cynical. He has none of it. He has no time for what Burton is trying to say. He doesn't want to see him, doesn't want to talk to him. And what Burton is trying to say to Chris before Chris is going on his mission is that the planet seems to be maybe trying to communicate, or there's some mystery there. There's something more than plain, scientific data and facts. There's something precious and important here. And the idea at that time is that we've been studying Solaris for a long time, but we still know nothing. The whole operation is not going well. It costs a lot of money. So essentially, like the United Nations are sending Chris on the station to decide if this is the end of the Solaris project. And possibly, very possibly, the science team on Earth is contemplating sending massive doses of X-rays on the planet. And it is not really explained what that would do, but it is clear that it would be very, very bad for the planet. It would potentially have dramatic, even catastrophic effects for the planet. Again, it's not explained, but by the way, for instance, Burton talks about it. It's not a little thing. It's potentially, as I said, catastrophic. And the thing is, of course, that Chris is pretty much for that option. He has no romance at all left in his heart. Chris Kelvin, he's cold facts, cold science. I'm going on the mission, and we'll probably close the station and so forth, and I'll come back and that will be it. And that's why he has this big argument with Burton, destroys the friendship between Burton and Chris's dad. But the other relationships we see, well, the relationship with Chris is also, and his father, it's good, it's loving, but there are a lot of unsaid things. At least that's the way I felt it. It's like it is a loving relationship, but the communication is still imperfect. All human relationships, or most of them at least, in the movie are like that. The final family relationship I will mention for now is that later on we learn that Chris's wife, who has now committed suicide, she did not get along at all with Chris's mother. They basically, like his mother hated his wife, Harry, she's called. So once again, basically what we have is the human beings don't get along with each other. But what really is happening is that while Earth is sending us a form of communication through beauty, so while in effect God is sending us communication through beauty, the human beings have lost this ability to communicate with each other. So between the humans themselves, which are part of nature, but between the humans themselves, no communication seems to be working. And lastly, for the Earth part, well, this is where the city sequence comes in, because Burton slams the door and leaves with his son. We're no longer friends, he says to Harry's father. And so he drives in the city, and we see this famous or infamous 4-minute sequence of Burton's car driving in the tunnels in a big city where he's going. So what's going on here? Well, this is the alienation of the city. So we've just come from nature, where there is this constant contact with grace, beauty, and nature itself. And now we're entering what humans have built, which is this huge city where it's a huge monument to our incapacity to communicate not only with each other, but with nature itself. Entering the city sequence is the signifier or the symbol of the severance of relationship with nature itself. It is soul-crushing, it is soul-destroying, and that sequence more or less finishes with a shot of Burton and his son in the back seat, and his son is resting his head, and it's like, this is a drag. It's like, this is not fun, this is not good, this is not pleasant. If you've gone outside of the city for a few days and you come back to the big city, certainly I've had a feeling like that, where you start to come in the city and you feel this sense of oppression and of, people trying to sell you stuff, and it's noisy and everything is a bit too fast. So essentially, the way the entire Earth sequence is set up as a piece of art is there is nature, and it is beautiful, and it is communicating through us. Implicitly, it is very possible that it is God that is trying to express itself through nature. But yes, we have the beauty of nature, and we have this relationship through beauty, but human beings, they don't get along at all. On that level, the communication is completely broken and dysfunctional, and when we go to the city, it is even worse, and it is so bad, in fact, that we have lost the communication with nature itself. We are totally alienated from ourselves. It is horrible, it is terrible, and that is your Earth sequence. So afterwards, it finishes, I think, with Chris burning his papers, and he's saying goodbye to his old life, and he's very, again, cynical. All these things, they don't matter. Memories don't matter. All this is garbage. All this is worthless. Everything is worthless. He's a shell of a man, pretty much, Chris, at the beginning of the film, and we'll soon find out why. Having established that something ineffable, something cosmic and universal, something of deep, deep, deep beauty, so God, is expressing itself through beauty on Earth and mystery and so forth. When we arrive on Solaris, we start on the space station, and so that was built by humanity, and it's a mess like this. Nobody comes to greet Chris, and two scientists he meets on the station they seem pretty much insane, and the other one, who was his personal friend who was looking forward to meet, he's actually committed suicide, he's dead. The place is a mess, so the space station is a complete mess. But the planet itself, when we see it through the windows of the space station, it is supremely beautiful, an alien beauty. So the first aspect is, again as a piece of art, is that the beauty of Solaris, of this alien ocean planet, it's completely another world, but it is still a world that is reflecting, like beauty. And on this simple level, well, obviously, there's a parallel to be established with on Earth. So the question is, okay, so there's this ocean and it's majestic and all these shapes and so forth, but there are no living creatures on the planet besides the ocean itself. Like, the planet is alive, we're pretty sure of that. We're not sure if it's conscious at this stage, but there are no microorganisms living in what has the appearance of water. It's not really water, actually. It's just, okay, there's one organism, which is Solaris, and up to now, as far as Kelvin knew, it had not tried to communicate. Though there was this very strange event which astronaut Burton mentioned in his report, which, as I mentioned, is that he had seen a giant, 10-foot tall baby, and he later learned that the astronaut who had died on the planet, after an accident, had a child who was exactly that 10-foot tall child. He was a reproduction of that child who before that Burton had never seen. So essentially, we know from the beginning that the planet can produce images from the mind of people, from the memories of people, but we're not sure if it's deliberate before we get to the planet. What we will discover throughout the movie is that, well, yes, it's obviously deliberate, and the planet Solaris itself is learning how to communicate with us. And as I said at the end, it does succeed in communicating with us. And what is fascinating is that it learns this through human suffering and almost compassion. So as I mentioned, there is a science of solaristics, a study which collects data, but we know from the beginning of the movie that That science is at a standstill, and it's basically been at a standstill since day one. Nothing scientifically is really known about the planet Solaris. And perhaps because of something the humans did, perhaps because of an experiment, perhaps because we hurt the planet Solaris without knowing it, the planet seems to have become aware of us, and it started to probe our minds and to send us projections of what it found in our minds, so like the 10-foot-tall baby. And all these images come from our unconscious. But by the time Chris arrives, Solaris has learned a lot, so that communication has evolved a lot. And we never see all the apparitions of the other scientists, but we know they're still there. In fact, like Guibarian, so Chris's friend who committed suicide, there was a girl, and she's still around. We see her. We don't really see her face, but she leads Chris to the corpse in the morgue of Guibarian. And she, we hear her a couple of times. She has like bells on her, so when she walks, there's a ringing of the bell. Chris goes to meet Snout, one of the scientists. So there's basically two scientists left on board. Snout, who is rather nice, and Sartorius, who is he's very scientific, and he's not very friendly. And he doesn't like Chris at all, not very much. And he's still very devoted to his scientific mission. He's basically the only one left who is still very hardcore science on the station. And when Chris visits both Snout and later Sartorius, we see that they are also being visited by manifestations of their own psyche. And they are very strange. Like with Snout, I think it's a girl. We see her barely, like a glimpse in a hammock. We never really know what's going on. We guess from some things that are inferred in the movie that there's sometimes violence, because later it's his birthday and Snout comes an hour and a half too late, and his suit is damaged and ripped, but no. We don't really know what's going on. We don't know the depth of the relationship. But with Sartorius, there are two creatures at least that appear. One is a dwarf that runs out of the lab, a very striking sequence. It's kind of funny and very strange. It's certainly very memorable. The first time Chris goes to talk to Sartorius, and he knocks on the door, and Sartorius doesn't want to open the door, and okay, I'll come out, but don't come in. And during that sequence, like, the door opens and a dwarf runs out, very small, and Sartorius picks him and shoves him back in the lab. So what is going on here? And we know that Sartorius is treating these apparitions not as people, but as things, as objects. He's dissecting them more or less. He's studying them like a physical study, like material, scientific material. He does not believe these creatures have anything to do with a form of real conscience and so forth. And we also know that there is something like a child on board, because we never see the child himself or herself, but we see a ball, like a toy ball, and at the end of the movie, Sartorius picks it up. So I understood it to mean that it was one of the apparitions he had, and we just never see it because we don't see his story, but there's a lot going on there actually. But all these things, what do they tell us, is that up until Chris arrives on the station, the scientists are receiving visits from the planet and its manifestations of their psyche, and they're dealing with it, sometimes okay, sometimes not okay at all. But it's still unsure at that time if the planet is trying to talk to them. But when Chris arrives, even though he seems very distant and non-receptive at all, Solaris produces the image of his dead ex-wife, who killed herself, and an act for which Chris feels very, 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 very responsible. When that apparition created by Solaris from the psyche of Chris. When she appears, she has no memory except just a few. She knows she likes Chris, she knows she loves Chris, but she feels both like a complete person and an empty person at the same time, and that whole sequence expresses that. But as the movie progresses, Harry, the name of that character, the dead ex-wife, the apparition of Harry comes to realize further and further, as the movie goes on, she comes to realize that she's not human, she's not Harry, she knows it, she doesn't know who she is, but she loves Chris, and she's afraid, and she feels real pain and real suffering and real, and also like beauty and all these things. But she's essentially becoming human, and she tries to kill herself eventually, like more than once. And the thing is, she's not made of atoms, she's made of neutrinos. So she does not actually have a human body. It just looks and it behaves like a human body from the exterior, but it can't die. So she drinks liquid oxygen, and that kills her, but she comes back to life. And they all come back to life like that, all the apparitions. But what's meaningful here is that, first of all the psychic and emotional armor that Chris had built around his heart break and dissipate, and very, very, very soon he comes to see the Harry apparition as his real ex-wife, which creates a lot of conflict, certainly with Sartorius. And even if she isn't, he still loves her very, very much. And that is basically how the planet learns to communicate with us. And by the end of the movie, the scientists on the space station have sent like an image of Chris's encephalogram. So basically, they have sent a coded transmission of Chris's brain to the planet in a further attempt to communicate. And after they do that, the planet stops sending them apparitions. They just stop coming. And Chris has a dream. He dreams of his mother, and he says he's alone, and he's sad, and he's hurting. And his mother, which is Solaris. And we know this because as he's falling asleep at that stage, we see that around him, many different apparitions of Harry, his ex-wife, appear in the room. And previously, when Chris was sleeping, she completely disappeared. We see this a couple of times in the movie. But now, when Chris falls asleep, she is still there. In fact, there are like 4 or 5 copies of her around him. And there is also a copy of his mother in the room. His mother as he remembers her, when she was in her 20s. And Chris has his dream. He dreams of his mother, and she cleans his wounds and she comforts him. And when he wakes up, Harry is gone. She has found a way to commit suicide for good, with the help of the other scientists. And she has written a letter that explains that it was she who asked for it. She insisted on it, and it was her idea. And she is gone forever. Chris had already decided by that stage that he would not be going back to Earth because he wanted to spend his life with her, which meant staying there, but now she is gone. But while there are no more apparitions on the planet, Snout, one of the 2 scientists, explains to Chris that islands have started appearing on the planet. So not only forms like the giant baby, but actual physical places that look like Earth islands, like Earth places. Like the planet is preparing a space where communication can actually happen. And at first Chris is unsure, but he goes down on the planet, and I'm telling you the end of the story. I'll presume if you're watching this that you've seen it. And when he comes down on the planet, it's his cottage from the beginning. So this place that is extremely dear to his heart, the last place he goes to before going into space, knowing it might be the last place on Earth he ever sees, which it is. So Solaris has created this island, which is a reproduction of Earth, which is the most dear to his heart, where we have, again, the water and the beauty and the expressions of, nature and all these things, with all the depth of meaning that has. But also his father is there, an apparition of his father. So we had his ex-wife, we had his mother in his dream, and now we have his father, which is obviously Solaris. And by that time, Chris knows that these apparitions are the planet and that it is communicating with him. And it is now a conscious communication, because the creation of these islands is a response to Chris's brainwaves. And we see this father, which is his father, but which is both his father and the planet. And he goes to this Solaris father and he kneels down and he assumes the pose from Rembrandt's Prodigal Son. I did not know this. I did not pick up on this. I saw that, I did some research and I said, oh yeah, okay. So there's a painting by Rembrandt which describes the very famous part of the Bible, the story of the prodigal son. The son asks for his father's inheritance, and before his father is dead, so father says, okay, dissipates everything in, debauchery and so forth. And eventually he says, well, I've dishonored myself and my family, and I'm poor and destitute and in the street. I will ask my father to take me back, and I will work, I will feed the pigs. And at least I'll have a roof, and So when he comes back, his father greets him with open heart and with boundless joy. And the brothers are jealous and they're angry and they're saying, why are you greeting him? He dishonored our family and he went away and so forth. And the father said, well, I love you all with all my heart, but you I have never lost. You are all here, and I love you very dearly. But I also love very dearly, and he left, and I thought I had lost him, but now he is back. So this is the greatest day ever. So that is the prodigal son, and he, gives him the greatest robes and all these things. Well, obviously that is an analogy from of the relationship between man and God. And there are many ways of interpreting it, but it is man turning back to God. That is the point of this story in the Bible. So what do we have at the end of the movie? Well, we had, at the beginning, Earth is communicating with us through beauty, but we're not sure what's happening. All the humans have trouble communicating, all these things. And this alien planet is also trying to communicate with us, though we're not sure at the beginning, but eventually, yes, it is trying to communicate. And when it finally does, it reproduces all this beauty from Earth. And it takes the form of the Father, like God the Father in the Christian Trinity. And our hero, Chris Kelvin, kneels down like the prodigal son, and the movie finishes. So yeah, obviously it's God. I mean, it can't get any clearer than that. If you have the prodigal son and, the old man, the wise old man with the beard, basically, like God as the wise old man with the beard, and, our hero, after, his martyrdom, his Calvary, he comes back penitent, essentially. For an artist that is so subtle and capable of, holding back, it seems like a very flashing message. Yeah, this is God, this is old guy in the clouds, and this is the prodigal son, we have come back to God. There it is. But is it so obvious? I mean, that part is obvious. That part, it is very obvious that this is what's going on. However, Solaris is taking the images from the subconscious, from the unconscious. And this is my interpretation of the whole thing. There are two ways of looking for God. You can look for God in the outside world, looking for God in the wonder of beauty. I'm looking for God in the laws of the universe, in the stars, all these things, like in art. But there's also, I will look for God by going inside, which is usually the last place we want to look. But as we'll see in a moment, it's universal. Like pretty much all cultures express very, very deeply. Usually the deepest expressions of a culture are where it talks about looking for God by going inside. So for us in the West, the most obvious, and that's the main tack I'll be taking here, is what the movie shows essentially is the unconscious. Okay, so it's going inside by studying the unconscious, by looking at what is unconscious. And of course, the idea of an unconscious is more or less something that Freud kind of came up with, like as an idea. It was there, but the way we think about it, it's very determined by psychoanalysis. There are many schools of psychoanalysis, many kind of thought leaders of psychoanalysis, many great icons, if you will, of psychoanalysis. And the three ones I will mention it here, but very quickly, because I will focus on one, are Freud, Lacan, and Carl Jung. There are many others, but those are the three ones, the three main ones. And Freud, of course, is the initiator of psychoanalysis. He created the science of psychoanalysis. And he has it seems very rigid. It's actually not, but Freud tends to have, it feels dogmatic when he's talking about it. Though when you look at what Freud actually says, it's more subtle than that, and he changes his mind many times, which is normal because he's studying these things, revises his theories. But the short version is that, at least to my mind, I'm not sure how many people still believe Freud had it right. Like in all the psychoanalysis schools, Freud was the great father figure, the initiator, but his time has passed. And I think it's mainly, but that is, you would need to go read the actual text for that. But there's reasons to believe that he's not always, he writes very well and he's very smart, but he's not always intellectually super honest, if we're being sincere. And there's indications of that from, for instance, his correspondence with Jung and his interactions with Jung and so forth. But anyway, Freud was very influential amongst French philosophers, for instance, like certainly Derrida has some very important writings that deal with Freud. And this is normal because for philosophy, psychoanalysis was a huge paradigm shift. And after the coming of science and the idea that old metaphysics no longer worked, well, it was very attractive to say that, okay, well, we don't have the old metaphysics, we know that doesn't work, but we can, if you like, I'm doing a very simple version here, but we can, study the depths of the soul like old philosophers by using a modern scientific approach, which is Freud, and we have no choice but to take that into account because we know this now, that there is something like the unconscious, and we will use Freud's model because he's the main authority, he's a big scientist, a doctor, so there's good reason to do that. And if you do that, you come up with a certain set of possible conclusions. I mean, if you take the Freud model, you will tend to go into a certain direction with at least part of your reflection. This is normal. And I like Derrida very much, and I think he's very, kind of misunderstood. I mean, he's used in a way that I don't think he meant to be used, but that's a topic for another day. I mentioned Lacan briefly, and I will stay very brief on Lacan because I don't know him very well. He writes in French, so I could read it, but I don't have his books. They're very hard to read. You have to read a lot of them, I think, to really understand what he's saying. He has recorded like a long video interview, but it's not it's almost unwatchable because he has these huge affectations. He's not very good on camera. Apparently in person he was great, but anyway, so I have not read it yet. What I have read, at least briefly, is Zizek's comments about Lacan, and I read actually just a few pages, saw interviews and so forth. But what I found really interesting is that because he's using Lacan, because he recognizes a form of depth in Lacan which corresponds to how he perceives things, okay, that also takes him into a certain direction. And very brief description of what I understood he was saying is basically that there is no unconscious. So it's psychoanalysis, but saying that there is nothing repressed, there is no actual consciousness, no actual, unconscious, and it's linked with his interpretation of the dialectic, which is super interesting, which is not thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, but is more like there is a Moebius strip. It appears like there are two sides, but there's only one side actually. So whenever you're walking on the Moebius strip, even if you think there is an unconscious, it is not actually there, is the short version. So again, I did not read the whole thing. It's on my very big reading list. I love it. It's great. Like the Zizek book I've been reading, it's excellent, excellent, excellent. But unlike him, which I like him, I respect him, but unlike him, not only do I believe there is an unconscious, but I would say that I know it for a fact. And that is because I'm more of the Jungian school. And Jung, there's a famous debate between Zizek and Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson, you like him or you don't like him. I'm a bit of both, actually. I think he's justly criticized on certain things, like he doesn't understand Marx at all, but that doesn't mean that when he criticizes what he calls Marxism, that he's necessarily wrong on everything, but that's another topic. He does have some interesting things to say, most notably about beauty. I talk a lot about that here. So even though I'm totally on the opposite end of the ideological spectrum in terms of Peterson, I still think he has lots of things he says that are actually pretty worthwhile, even if his public characters, only recently with the extravagant clothes and so forth, it looks kind of, let's say odd. That is neither here nor there, essentially here. What is interesting here is that Peterson is a Jungian analyst. I think that Solaris works very well, extremely well, when we take it as a metaphor or an allegory of the structure of the psyche as Jung presents it. I have not read Peterson's books. Certainly from what I hear, he has or had a practice as a Jungian analyst, and I am pretty sure he did well doing that. I would tend to believe that he had good results doing that. But I'm mentioning all this because I still suspect that his understanding of Jung and mine are different. Because I'm not coming at it from an intellectual perspective. I'm coming at it from a lived perspective. And here is where I will quote an actual quote from Jung, which is from this book here, which is called The Psychology of C.J. Jung by Yolande Jacobi. And there's a foreword by Jung in it, which I will read from presently. So Jung says, in reference to this book, "It is a particular satisfaction to me," says Jung, "that the author," so Jacobi, "has been able to avoid furnishing any support to the opinion that my researches," so Jung's researches, "constitute a doctrinal system. Such expositions slip all too easily into a dogmatic style which is wholly inappropriate to my views," to Jung's views. since it is my firm conviction that the time for an all-inclusive theory, taking in and describing all the contents, processes, and phenomena of the psyche from one central viewpoint, has not yet arrived. I regard my concepts as suggestions and attempts at the formulation of a new scientific psychology based in the first place upon immediate experience with human beings. This is not a kind of psychopathology, but a general psychology, which also takes cognizance of the empirical material of pathology. So what is he saying here, basically, is that he, and this is like at the end of his life when he's writing this, he's basically saying, I spent all my life studying the human psyche, and he has done that by looking into his own psyche. So the core thing with Jung is that he not only studied his patients, but he dove for like 4 or 5 years at least into the deepest recess of his own psyche, and he almost went completely insane doing that. And we know all this, and we have a record of this because he wrote something which is called the Red Book, which is filled with his illustrations and so forth, which is the journal of this incredible discovery, this experience. It's been published, it was published after his death. During the process of writing the Red Book, of exploring his own psyche, what did Jung do? He looked into himself and basically found God. But what did he actually find? So 2 things basically. So he found that, yeah, he has this personality, and in his psyche, unconscious at first, he found that there were all these, like layers of, the shadow, very famously. And he found like the shadow, which is all the parts of ourselves that we do not acknowledge. And so I'm a good person, but you have all these bad feelings and you hide them, so that's the shadow. There are, the archetypes and all these things, and archetypes are projections of the collective unconscious, and people talk about these things, and very frequently they talk about them from someone who has not lived it, right? But Jung was not talking, he was not describing something academic at all. What he was describing was a spiritual journey into his own soul. It shares striking similarities with the daimon of the Greeks, like Socrates had a daimon, So the daimon is the inner spirit that guides you, and in the case of Socrates would tell him, don't do that. And famously, Socrates accepted to kill himself because it was something between his daimon and himself. That, he was tried by the court of law, and they found him guilty of corrupting the youth, because he was, going against the gods or something like that. But from what I understand, for Socrates to agree to what the court was asking, which is recuse. The court was asking him, the Greek court was asking Socrates to recuse himself. It was telling him, no, say the gods are real and say that what you're saying was a mistake and we will let you live. And he could not do that to save his life, because that would have meant betraying his daimon and his relationship with his daimon. There was something in that relationship which was so powerful that there was no way he could get himself to do that. It was not possible. It was not even an option. Okay, so shamanic cultures have something like that. Even if you're not from a shamanic culture, it is very easy to have shamanic experiences. Like it's part of the human, biological baggage. It's super easy. You listen to some drum recordings, and you can enter into such a trance because of the number of beats. It's very documented. And, I will tell you a secret, I've done it like many times. Like many of the things I'm mentioning here, I've personally done, you see. So I know it works, So in terms of the shamanic cultures, you enter, you meet famously your spirit guide. And in the shamanic approach, you basically go into your imagination, which is what it is. Very often at first you have many doubts, but eventually you're going into your own psyche and you're seeing projections brought up from the depths of your own psyche, and you're guided by spirits and so forth. But these projections from your own psyche, there is a complete equivalent to that, like the shamanic journey, as it's called, which again you can find on YouTube, or there's a Michael Horner book, which is very easy to find. It's very easy to try it out. You can try it out at home. It's safe. It's doable. But if you compare that with a particular form of meditation that Jung describes, which you can also do, which is basically telling your irrational self, it's not unconscious at this point, it's your irrational self, your deeper you. Well, Jung has a meditation where you ask that part of you to speak, and what does it do? It sends images in your mind, and you can interact with it in that way. And it is exactly like shamanic journeying. It's very, very, very close. Not exactly, but strikingly close. Okay. So what do we have here? My conscious self is interacting with my, at first, unconscious self, but what turns out to be my irrational self. But not irrational in the sense that I'm very emotional and I'm losing control of myself. That is a biological thing. That is like fight flight. It is not irrational in that sense. It is non-rational, as in it is irrational. Like, we think that I'm this conscious person with, which makes sense of the world through ideas and concepts. But the deeper part of you, according to Jung, and again, this is something you can experience, it does not process the world at all like that. And it has no concept of time. It has no concepts of many, 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 many things like that, which we take for granted. So that goes into for instance, Jung's idea of synchronicity. Because why are all these meaningful coincidences happening? Because the outside world is a projection of your inner world, and ultimately, what Jung is saying is that so the outside world is, in many ways, a projection of your inner world, which is trying to reveal itself to you. Okay. So what is the link with Solaris here? Solaris is the unconscious. The unconscious communicates through us through images and through symbols. And that is why the archetypes appear in Jung's writings, But people focus a lot on the archetypes, and really, it doesn't matter all that much. You don't really need to focus too much on them. I mean, I don't care about them, honestly, because the actual practice is what you have in the movie. So you establish contact. You have, you're seeing your life and it's going, not very well, perhaps. You have all these issues that keep popping up. So that's a manifestation of your irrational that is trying to communicate with you. Those are the images sent by the planet, you see. And you meet all these people in your life, girlfriends, boyfriends, whatever, co-workers. But all these people, in effect, are also projections of our psyche. They behave that way. People say we train people to behave a certain way towards us. Well, what you find is that you tend to attract a certain type of person in your life that represents a part of you that needs to be acknowledged. This is very, very, very frequent. And you have that for, like, in romantic relationships, it's very frequent. And that's also one of the reasons why these relationships sometimes turn out not very good, because it's a difficult process, and very often we don't want to acknowledge that part. We want to fight it. It's more complicated than that, but the whole process is extremely messy, and it's also dangerous. It's also because the forces that we have buried inside us that are trying to express themselves, sometimes are very powerful, you see, much more powerful than we imagine. Like, intense rage is an easy thing. You see? But, okay, because what we have inside us are very, very deep psychic processes that are so powerful that, like the ancients presented them as gods. And these gods may not have an existence, like an outside existence in the way that perhaps, the Greeks of Socrates' time thought they did, but we underestimate their autonomy at our own peril. Like, we underestimate their power as psychic processes at our own peril. And there's a phenomenon, for instance, called, I think, like archetypal possession or something like what. Possession, it's a scary word, but what it means is that if we're not aware of the psychic processes that are happening inside us, very often what can happen is that they end up taking control of us, and we're not aware of it. And as long as all these things are happening inside us and the contact has not been established with the inner self, our deeper self, we're really in a lot of trouble because that unconscious is still trying to get our attention. It's still running our lives. So as long as you have not established contact with the unconscious, basically Jung says, it will run your life and you will call it destiny. And this process of coming into contact with the deeper, the real you, which is your irrational you, which basically knows all and sees all and communicates through images, intuition, and feelings, and all these things. So that process Jung calls individuation, because until you've done that, you are not really yourself. You think you're being yourself, but you are not. And we fight that, and which is why we look for God everywhere inside us, because we know we're going to find it there, and it's scary, and we don't want to do it, right? And also because like the ego fights it, but even our idea of the ego is loaded with unintentional and unhelpful meanings, but topic for another day. What is important now, and in relationship with Solaris, is that what has to happen for a human being to become an individual is to establish a firm relationship, like a working relationship, with our irrational unconscious self, which becomes conscious. And that is basically the daimon. Okay, that is basically, you're talking with a version of yourself which is, it's you, but it's not you at the same time. It's both at the same time. And what's the link with God? Well, because God is even further in you than that, guardian angel. Like the ceremonial magicians have a series of, like rituals and so forth. And the actual goal of ceremonial magic, even stuff like Aleister Crowley, who frightens a lot of people, but Aleister Crowley is basically Marilyn Manson. Okay, he's a shock rocker. He's scary because he wants to scare you because he thinks it's funny. Okay, so when he says, Aleister Crowley, I'm the Beast 666, he's trying to scare little old ladies because he was angry at his mother. That is Aleister Crowley. Okay, but if you read his magic books, there's lots of quotations that can seem scary, but what he's basically describing is coming into contact with this deeper self. Kabbalism, like the Kabbalah, like Hebrew mysticism, right, with the tree of life, which is the tree of life, which is a diagram of that very same thing, which is how spirit becomes matter. But it's also how a human being, like the psyche, the body, the emotions, and the soul and the personality, the tree of life is how that aligns with divinity. And how it does it is that's just another way of presenting this dialogue with the inner self, short version. Okay, when the Oracle of Delphi, the very famous Gnoti Sauton, like know thyself, okay, that is what they meant. Okay, when the Oracle of Delphi tells you you must learn to know yourself, it does not mean what is your favorite color and you like, musicals and, baseball movies, It is talking about that, because when you truly know yourself, to truly know yourself is to become an individual. And the way to do that is through communication with the irrational. It is this scary process, this scary exploration, which is done through symbols which come up from your unconscious, like Solaris is mentioning, is presenting us in the movie. And it includes our romantic relationships. It includes our relationships with our parents, with everybody, our working relationships. It includes the events of our lives. All these things, they seem external, but they're actually projections of, the planet that is God, that is trying to express itself to us. Okay, but the planet that is God is expressing itself. It seems that it's expressing itself as outward things, but the purpose of these external things is to bring you back to your deepest core. That brings you in contact with, guardian angel or whatever you call it. Doesn't matter, Manito, whatever, the daimon. And that daimon essentially tells you the will of God for your life. And the will of God for your life is usually exactly what you want, because life is well made. And usually what gets in the way is our upper personality, which is trying to protect us, but it's actually doing the opposite. It's making our life a mess. And people talk a lot about, the death of the ego, and we must... It's not the death of the ego or death of personality and all these things. It's just a realignment of priorities, and it's clearing the air so that you can hear the phone call of your own soul and conscience, which is telling you, like, do more gardening or whatever, learn to paint or whatever. Whatever is important for your own personal life, like where you're meant to be going, to be fulfilled and happy and helping everyone. So that is essentially the process of individuation, and that is what happens in the movie, and that is, Jung says so abundantly, and that is alchemy. Like, alchemy is a metaphor for this process, and the famous Alchemychal Wedding is the union of the conscious and the unconscious. Attaining the philosopher's stone is the union of the conscious and the unconscious. All these things is the union of the conscious and the unconscious, of the rational and the irrational. So you're making the irrational conscious, and that is the dangerous part, and it is long, and you need help to do that, and it is quite a process. Okay. But eventually, your rational learns to be in right relationship with the irrational, and the irrational is the part of you that communicates with what we call God, which is just a word. I'm sorry to say it, it's just a word. And in all these experiences, you will find that people say God exists, but others say that God does not exist, and it's both. Like, there is no true self. But there is a true self. You find your true self, but there is no true self. It is both. Like, there is no free will. Well, yeah, there is no free will, but there is free will. And the entire, like, spiritual experience or discovery of process of individuation is all made up of these kind of paradoxes. Like, there's a part of us that is wholly God, that is entirely pure Godhood. And we can't access it directly. Like, human beings cannot access the deepest part of themselves. We know this for a variety of reasons. You can get pretty close, but there's like, the deepest parts only, like your irrational, like the daimon or whatever you want to call it, doesn't matter. Only that part has access to it. And ultimately, only that part really knows if God exists or not, or if you exist or not. Only that part really understands what's going on. But we cannot access it. We do not, as conscious beings, have access to it. All we have are these images and intuitions and symbols and, like kind of like drives. And, at the end of the movie of Solaris, we still don't know what the planet like wants and what it is and what is it thinking, and it doesn't really matter. Like the relationship has been established. The bridge is there now. The contact is made now. And what happens afterwards is your whole life. So there is a mystery. There is the point. There is a part that you do not know and you cannot know, and that is always there. And it is when we forget that, or when we deny that because it is scary and uncomfortable, that is when we get into trouble. We don't acknowledge the unknown inside us or the person in front of me. So finally, Solaris, the planet, can be seen as a metaphor for God, and it can also be seen as a metaphor for our psyche, our irrational part, or our deepest part, our part that is trying to allow us to become the individual we are meant to be. In the Christian symbolism, you have the Father and the Spirit and the Son, and what is above is like what is below, like Hermes Trismegistus. So if we say like the human being is structured like a reflection of God, God made man in his image, and if we take the symbol of the Trinity, which is a way of presenting things, well, you have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, which is one way of presenting it. There are others. Well, in this case, God outside of me is the Father, and that is the highest form, and I cannot access that. It communicates in me, in the beauty of nature. And there is also the God I can access inside of me, but even then, the God as Father I cannot access, but I can access the Holy Spirit, right? Or the version in the microcosm, which is me, of the Holy Spirit, and that is the daimon. That is the daimon. But what is the Son? Well, the Son is what seems to be the small me, the part that is trying to individuate. And in the movie, Harry, the girl, she is that. She is us. The most human character in the entire movie is the apparition of that ex-wife who killed herself. And in the Alchemychal Wedding, okay, the bride is us. This is one of the things that is frequently misunderstood, but the idea is you have the male and the female, and the male is the active principle and the female is the passive principle. And some people nowadays, they tend to take offense at that, but is completely missing the point. Because in that alchemical symbol, the conscious you who is speaking to you now is always the passive principle. It is always the female. Like your your normal consciousness, your everyday consciousness, okay? That is the bride in the Alchemychal Wedding. And the active principle is the God principle that is trying to communicate with you. And that is the active principle. And the big thing in, alchemy and psychological alchemy ultimately is that you have to do nothing. You have to accept to be done unto. You have to completely let go any idea that you know what you're doing and that you're conscious or thinks that it's conscious personality knows anything and has any power at all to do anything. You are completely powerless in many ways, okay? But still, in the alchemical metaphor, the conscious you, so-called conscious you, is the bride. But in the Christian symbolism of the Trinity, it is the Son, right? So the Son is this personality who is talking to you, Father, and the Holy Ghost, or Holy Spirit, and the Son. And who is the son here? Well, the son is Tarkovsky, is Andrei Tarkovsky. And what we're seeing here, which is so wonderful, is that the movie is a perfect illustration of how an individual is an expression of God. And this is an expression of somebody whose entire work, like his 7 movies, official movies he directed in his official career, they are all about this sense of mystery, like a relationship with the mystery of the divine. It's always there. It's a very big theme in all his movies. So this is someone who was aching for that relationship. Actually, he felt that relationship as an aching and questioning, and it's always there. But what we're seeing is that the mystery he's looking for is expressing itself through him and through the ways he finds to try to access the answer. So how do we know this? How do we see this? Well, we see this because Tarkovsky has a very peculiar style and personality and uniqueness that shows in all his movies, which is very personal to him. So there are things that are very common across, many Soviet movies. Like the rhythm tends to be slower. So there are things that are common to other, cineasts from the USSR certainly. But there are many things throughout the movie which are 100% Tarkovsky and which you recognize when you've seen all his movies. So the pace I've mentioned, like he's very, even if Soviet movies often are slower than Western movies, Tarkovsky is well known for his very slow pace, and it has a reason. And one of the reasons is that it lets us absorb the beauty and the magnitude of what we're seeing. He says he's sculpting in time, very famously. Tarkovsky said that. In the Sacrifice, for instance, at the beginning, there's a long sequence where you have a father and his son, and they have a friend, and they're talking, and they're walking in a field, and one of the friend is on a bicycle. This lasts something like 10 minutes in my memory. So it's a long sequence, and it's kind of like a tracking shot in this field. And this establishes a rhythm, and which is often described as meditative. And yes, sometimes it can be so it can be boring. I mean, if we're being honest, like even Tarkovsky kind of said so. I think when he was talking about nostalgia, he said, even, I think maybe I went a little too far with the slow aesthetic or something like that, he said. But and it's true. I mean, it may be a bit too slow, but it's still a masterpiece. He's trying to express something important through that, and it is a conscious choice he's making, which is ultimately personal to him, and that is the point here. Same thing with his very involved compositions, right? Why does water come so frequently in his films? Like, why do we see so much water? Well, it's very textured, and at the same time, it's very earthly. It's something physical, and it's something uncontrollable. And in that water, very often we have, as I said, like the seaweed or things like that, or fish, crumpled papers and so forth. There is a specific, very distinct way of expressing richness and depth and visual depth that is typical Tarkovsky. Also, like the horses, that you have horses here in the movie, evidently had a lot of meaning for Tarkovsky. I think it was something about life force or whatever. And honestly, I'm not really sure what it meant for him, but obviously it meant something because horses appear in many of his movies. Like I have the one in Andrei Rublev, for instance. Like there's a horse that is killed during a battle. You have the horses, you have a levitation scene. So you have levitation scenes, and I think more than one of his movies. You have one here because it's, we're floating in space, but there's the famous kiss in Yvonne's childhood. A soldier is holding a girl. Well, she's not levitating, but it's something like that, right? She's across a ravine or something like that. Later on, I think in Mirror, you have the image of someone levitating in a Tarkovsky movie comes very frequently. Many of his movies have that. It means something, and it means something in a movie that is ostensibly not supernatural. So Mirror is all memories of his mother and of his childhood, and it's a story of a writer who has cancer, and I think it's that one. So he's thinking about episodes from his past. It's not science fiction, but you have a levitation scene in that movie, and it's very powerful. It's very meaningful. So you have all these aspects of Tarkovsky movies that keep showing up from one movie to another. And why is that? Because he's sensing something. I would say probably because, some part of his intuition, some part of his deeper self, perhaps, like something in him is telling him, you're working with this. You have something to find here, Not to be sacrilegious, but, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when the father is making the mountain with the mashed potatoes, well, all artists are like that. I'm an artist. I mean, that's what it is. You have this thing inside you, and you seem to be repeating yourself, but you're trying to find a better way of expressing something deep that you need to figure out what it is because it's super important, and that is a part of something in you. But also, and this is interesting, Tarkovsky is Russian, and I've been, thanks to Alexander, the blogger, who again I say hi to, and we've been having this dialogue, which is wonderful, and cultural dialogue, and he published an article about one of my videos on his blog, and I read the comments. And some of them are very nice, and some of them are, they are stupid Westerners and stuff like that. That came about because it became clear, and in great part because of that exchange with Alexander, but it became very, very clear that the Soviet movies are trying to express something, and Russian culture in general is trying to express something, and that it was being missed, and that it was painful. It seemed to be painful for the Russian people that they were trying to say something, and they were trying to open, cultural dialogue, as Alexander says, rightly so. And they were not being received, and they were not received in the West because of political reasons. And some of those reasons may be good, and many of them are certainly not good, but the fact is there was an attempt at expressing something, and in the West we say, it's all propaganda, and it's not true. I mean, even if there is propaganda, and even if I'm not seeing it, even if it were propaganda, it would still be an attempt to express something real. That is the thing. It would be a trick, like the collective unconscious of the Russians would be using to try. I mean, even if you're trying, even if you're being devious and critical, you're still expressing something. But I don't think Russian movies are generally devious and critical. I mean, it doesn't matter. There's something trying to express itself, and there's something what appears to me from the outside to be typically Russian. And I will give one example of that. And I will mention this because I'm also from a culture, I'm Québécois, right? And I'm also today is our national holiday for us, for the Québécois, Saint Jean-Baptiste. And, we were conquered by the British Empire. So we're part of the British Empire. Even if it collapsed, it no longer calls itself that, but, the dynamic is still the same. I'm also from a collective like the Québécois, which is part of the Canadiens, which are the French in Canada, which are one of the French peoples in Canada, which because there's the Acadiens also, and there's the Métis, which are part French and part Native American mixed together. They're mostly in Manitoba, but they're all over. So you have all these groups, you see, and we sometimes we don't get along with each other. But when you have an empire, and the Soviet Union in many ways had an empire, like the Soviet Union was more or less an empire in some ways. Certainly some of the states, from what I saw, wasn't there, but some of the states didn't seem to be so happy. Some of them were more happy than others, from what I've seen. I'm not judging, I'm just saying. There were political reasons, Cold War and so forth, and it happened that way. Right or wrong, it happened that way. But when you're part of an empire is a narrative. An empire, no matter what it says, is one culture. I mean, there's one group, like one ethnic group. You can have, 5,000 cultures in it, but there's one of them that is the ruler. There always is one. Okay, an empire is one narrative that frames all the others and that allows all the people it controls and has conquered. It allows them to express themselves, but within the confines of that imperial narrative, you see. And if you have two empires and one of them wins, one of them wins, one of them is more powerful and the other loses, well, then you also have a narrative, and the weaker one is always the bad guy, yes? No matter how you see the morality of what one did and what the other did and all these things, which is one topic, and it needs to be acknowledged, it needs to be worked through, it needs to be healed, and like an empire is an abusive relationship, and in an abusive relationship, both people need healing, right? And I'm mentioning all this because no matter how bad the USSR in the eyes of the West was, and now no matter how wrong or right or in between the West was, the fact remains that every culture is beautiful. And clearly there is something in Russian culture that has been trying to express itself, like desperately trying to express itself. And it is seen in Tarkovsky's work. And the only example I really give, but I could mention all the collaborators, all the actors, and there are frequently people who have worked in other Tarkovsky movies. Anatoly Solzhenitsyn, who plays Sartorius, he plays in everything. He's like he's Andrei Rublev. He's one of the guys in Stalker and so forth. Natalia Bondarchuk, who plays Harry. She's the daughter of Sergei Bondarchuk, very famous director in the USSR. Vladislav Dvoretsky, I'm not sure how his name is pronounced. He plays Burton. So he died very young, but he's very, very good. He played the Captain Nemo in a TV movie, a TV series in the 70s. Looked very good. So you have all these people. The music by Artemiev, so legendary composer from the 70s, legendary in great deal because of his work with Tarkovsky, but his music, his score is brilliant here. So that's part of the Russian expression, but was really evidently a part of both Tarkovsky, but Tarkovsky as a Russian, and there are many aspects, but there is one which is the intertextuality, and which is one of the reasons I mentioned the blog with Alexander, is that it is amazing how cultured the Russians are. Russian people, from what I've seen, like the normal average Russian person, is incredibly well-read and cultured, and they know culture. Like they know books from all over, and Enfant de l'Est, a very, very good channel by this girl who's very cool, and she has this channel where she talks about Soviet culture, basically. And she mentioned all those movies that were adaptations of like the Three Musketeers, and there's the very famous Sherlock Holmes. So there's this love of culture in Russia and of world culture, and a real love. And it expresses itself through adaptations of these works, like Sherlock Holmes, which are respectful and loving, but 1000% Russian expressions. The way the Sherlock Holmes is set up, for instance, it focuses very much on the first episode focuses very much on the relationship between Watson and Holmes in a way that I've only seen in a Russian movie, which is excellent, and which I could see comparisons with, scenes in like Moon Rainbow, like the way, the focus on what the West calls psychology, but which is deeper and a bit different here. Right? It's just the flavor is different. The emphasis is a little bit different, like the way the personal relationships are treated. And you have that also here. But what you have really here, I mentioned like the intertextuality, is the movie, and this is very Tarkovsky, but it's also very Russian. The movie is jam-packed with references of, like Bruegel references. And I think we have the Beethoven's Death Mask is in one of the rooms. And the music by Bach, obviously. So Artemiev quotes a Bach score, and you have that, I think, in a few of his movies. Tarkovsky's, it's very, very good. And Tarkovsky famously did that because he said cinema is a young art form and it doesn't have the history, essentially. So we have to dig into the other art forms to get the depth that we don't have yet in cinema. I'm paraphrasing, but it's more or less what he said. So in effect, what you have is a movie which is filled, all the way through with references which are both evident, like, you have a picture of a Bruegel painting and you have two tracking shots and you see it like 2 minutes in the movie, right? So we have that in Solaris. But also there's the reference to the Prodigal Son, like the Rembrandt painting, which I'm sure it's probably, I'm guessing that the Russian viewers picked up on it quicker than I did. It's a direct quotation, but it's still subtle enough that you can miss it and you can say, well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't a quotation. But the idea here is that the sensitivity is that we are building meaning and beauty through the relationship with other works of art. And that is an expression of something that is, it seems to be, from what I can see, it is something that is very Russian and it's very beautiful. I mean, it's incredibly rich. Yeah, I often think about how apparently in Moscow, in the metro, like the subway, they had classical paintings, like museum level masterpieces in the subway, so that anybody could see them. And maybe if you're from Russia, you can verify if that was the case, but I read that many times, and even if it was partly, propaganda, so it was still, let's show works of art to everyday people in the metro so everybody can appreciate it. I mean, it was still wonderful. What I'm getting at here is that I did not pick up until recently, having seen more Russian movies and having talked with Russian people, which is very nice, that was a part of Russian culture, which I did not know anything about, right? And again, also like the Russians, I have a culture. And it's not just works of art, it's an entire way of interacting with the universe, you see. And it's very precious. And mine is very small, you see. But it is still precious. So final thing I will say, finally, is about the intertextuality and the Russian thing and the individuality and all these things, how all this ultimately still Solaris talking to us, you see. The intertextuality between the movies of Tarkovsky himself. So there is an icon, an Andrei Rublev icon in Chris Kelvin's room. And when I say the thing about beauty, I get the impression that the Orthodox Church, a big part of their spiritual practice is they create these icons, like Christ paintings in gold and very delicate, very, intricate works of art. And that is, okay, I am interacting with God through beauty. So I get the feeling that when they are showing all these works of art from all over the world, well, does that not echo? Yes, the icon is definitely trying to do that. I'm showing an icon with Christ and the Virgin Mary and whatever. And it is an act of devotion to God. But it is an act of devotion not only through what is shown, but through the artistic expression that it is. That is the impression I'm getting. Here, my devotion is creating a work of art. So what it tells me is that, yeah, it's a culture where creating works of art is, at least implicitly, an act of devotion in relationship to God. And I keep using the word God. I don't like religion. I think God is a very loaded word, but God, the word points to something, which is this cosmos, universe, and our relationship to it, and this thing we have inside us, which is infinitely deep and wonderful. It is something like God, like what we call God. What's fascinating is that, so before Solaris, Tarkovsky did a movie called Andrei Rublev, or The Passion According to Andrei, which is the long version, which is the one I saw, which is mind-blowing. I mean, I frequently think of this movie, which is about this very famous icon painter, and it's about, how he becomes, through suffering, this artist capable of creating these great works of art which expresses divinity. And it's his seeking and all these things. Well, so Tarkovsky made the Andrei Rublev movie, which is transcendent. So if creating art is continuing this tradition of art as trying to communicate with God, you see, expressing divinity to God and with God, dialoguing with God, well, then his movie Andrei Rublev is that. And there is a picture, there is a reproduction of an Andrei Rublev icon in Chris's room, you see. And the point is that every movie of Tarkovsky is featured in every movie of Tarkovsky. It's like the work of Andrei Tarkovsky echoes to itself forwards and backwards in time. Like I mentioned, I think in Mirror, I didn't check before the video, but from memory, I'm pretty sure that the guy dies of cancer. It's about an author who dies of cancer. Well, famously, Tarkovsky died of cancer, and he died of cancer apparently because he shut down nuclear plant when he did Stalker. Yeah. And he had to go there. He got the cancer because his first version of Stalker was destroyed in a lab accident. So think about that, So there's this strange echo there. There's the burning house in Mirror, and there's the burning house at the end of Sacrifice. And there's also the very, very famous burning scene. I won't spoil it for those who haven't seen it, but there's a very striking burning scene at the end of Nostalgia, a scene that involves fire. So there's that, that series of references. And there's a poster of Andrei Rublev, the movie, apparently, in Mirror. So he's directly quoting himself. There's the fact that his actors, come back, as I mentioned, Solzhenitsyn. So you have all these different ways in which, the movies of Tarkovsky are, I don't get the feeling he's building an oeuvre, a body of work. It's like the body of work was always there. It just seemed to appear to us as if he made them chronologically. So there's an element of that. But what I do think expresses a form of evolution is the difference between Solaris and Sacrifice. And Sacrifice is a movie I really deeply, deeply, deeply loved. I mean, I did a video on it on another channel, and I could not recommend this movie highly enough. And the comparison is between, and this is my last point for this video, the comparison is between Solaris and Andrei Rublev and Sacrifice. So Rublev is before Solaris, but I will start with Solaris. So in Solaris, you have this character, and ultimately he has lost his contact with with himself. He still loves nature, but he's basically, like I said, Chris Kelvin is more or less a shell of a man. He's all in his head and his heart is closed. And God speaks to him and he establishes the contact. And at the end, the prodigal son has returned and God has, reestablished contact with Tarkovsky. Chris Kelvin as an extension of Tarkovsky. It's his movie, it's his story. But it seems so on the nose, like God, the wise old man with a beard, and the prodigal son, the hero. It's so obvious when you pick up on it that I can't help but think that he was expressing, when you're expressing that level of certainty, usually you're trying to convince yourself, is the impression I get. And that, Tarkovsky mentioned that he felt that movie wasn't as successful as the others, and that was not what he meant. But when I saw that yesterday, when I watched it, I told myself, it's so obvious that, how much is that Tarkovsky trying to convince himself that God is out there and he's trying to communicate with him and he can establish this contact. He seems to be telling us that I know it for a fact, but how much of that is actually, it's a wish, it's a prayer, but it's a prayer that, please God, talk to me. So that would be Solaris, right? In Andrei Rublev, there's a very, powerful sequence where Andrei, he's this legendary, he will become like the greatest icon painter in history. And it's how he becomes that. It's how he becomes this great, great, great artist. And it's 3 hours and a half, and he goes through a lot of hardship, and he renounces art for a long time, and eventually, by the end of the movie, we see that he will pick it up again and become the great Andrei Rublev. But it's during the Middle Ages, essentially, and there's a pagan festival, a pagan ritual, which lasts about 20-25 minutes, and it's an orgy. It's naked people running around and having sex. That's what it is. And in the morning, the army of the prince kills everybody. It finds them and kills them because they are pagan and the state is Christian, so they need to be destroyed. So that's historically, it's very, very, very interesting. And I saw some comments that said that it was a criticism of paganism by Tarkovsky. And I did not see that in the movie. That was not what I saw in the movie at all. I don't think that's what it was. But maybe it was. That's not my impression. What is certain is that by the time Sacrifice comes, and Sacrifice is Tarkovsky's final movie, Sacrifice is about the end of the world. I'm getting emotional just thinking about it. So you have this very famous artist, writer, I think he is, in his 50s, and he has a young son who is like 10 years old. And by that time, Tarkovsky knows he's dying. He knows this is his last movie, and he's making it in exile. And so it's this story of this 50-year-old, great accomplished artist, but who hasn't written anything in like 10 years. It's his birthday, the author's birthday, the hero's birthday. And he has all his friends, but things are very tense with his wife and so forth. And the television comes on and it says, World War III has basically just started, and by morning, everyone will be dead on Earth. And the movie is called Sacrifice. So we know there's a sacrifice involved. And we have seen the hero of Sacrifice with his son, who he loves more than anything. And we have also seen the father with the gun. There is a gun. We have seen it, like a pistol. And, we know Tarkovsky is Christian. And in the Bible, there are two sacrifices. Two very famous sacrifices. One is Jesus, who sacrificed himself, God's only God-given son, according to, the main Christian interpretation. So God kills his son for humanity. And the other is Abraham, I think, yes, from memory. So an angel says to Abraham, you will kill your son because God says so. And so he goes on the mountain and he's about to kill his son. And the angel comes, no, don't do it. Just a test. But the fact is that the movie is called Sacrifice, and a father, a son, a gun, and the end of the world on television, and the announcer is crying basically, and he's saying, well, only a miracle can save us now. And the main character goes into his room and he prays to God. He says, please God, I will sacrifice the thing I love the most on earth, the thing I love with all my heart. I will sacrifice that to you if you let the world live. So you're saying, yeah, the kid, the son, the gun. So he makes this prayer, and there's a witch in the village. It's modern. It's a modern story, obviously, nuclear weapons. But there's a witch in the village. She's like this, healer. But she's basically she's pagan. She is pagan. And our hero, who has just prayed to God, he goes to the pagan lady, and he has sex with her. So the way Sacrifice is set up is that Tarkovsky, who seems to be a very devout Orthodox Christian, presents a situation where the world is saved through the physical consummation. So the least sacred thing, according to some religions. Certainly it's often frowned upon. So the most down-to-earth thing. So this Christian guy sleeps with this pagan woman, and I think that's when they levitate. And in the morning, the world is saved. So the miracle happened. What will the hero sacrifice? What does he do after that? And I urge you to see it. It's wonderful. It's transcendent. It's extraordinary. But certainly in Solaris, you have the expression of theological certainty, of relationship to God as the establishment of this contact and its certainty. And here you have the contact, and you have an answered prayer, but an element of that is through, like sex, and it is through, physical groundedness, like the physical body, and it is through this meeting between, paganism and Christianity. And the movie presents it. It does not delve upon it. It asks the question. It shows it. And it shows how the world has been saved through that. And the prayer has been answered. An answered prayer for something that was impossible, preventing World War III. And it works. But what there isn't there is anything that alleviates the mystery of being alive. And I always come back to that these days. So in Solaris, during the birthday party, Snout's birthday party, Snout says, we don't need other worlds. We need mirrors. And once again, you have this kind of, mirror, like echo effect in the past and the future, because Tarkovsky did the mirror, as his next movie, I think it was. So yeah, okay, we don't need other worlds. We need mirrors. But the thing is, what Solaris shows us, like in the movie, and like what the planet is, what Solaris shows us is that the world is the mirror. Like the beauty of the world, the mystery of the world, the richness of the world, the horror of the world, like the pain of the world. And we are part of that world. And we are part of that beauty and everything else. That means that everything we do is also a mirror of that which is trying to express itself through this world. So the question was, is Solaris God? Well, yes, but everything is God. Everything is the mirror of God. Everything is what we call God. Okay. Because the word God is a distorting mirror. But the world and we in the world are the mirrors through which God discovers himself, like explores the joy and wonder and amazement and awe of mystery of himself to himself. So yes, Solaris is God, but so is Earth, and so is Tarkosvky, and so are we.